I think it has the opportunity to be extremely severe. I mean, you were hearing mention of fertilizers, and I think that's actually probably the biggest risk we have at the moment is the sort of the energy price shock that we're experiencing at the moment, feeding through to fertilizer prices, and that feeding through to food prices. And exacerbating that is obviously the loss of supply from Ukraine and potentially from Russia of wheat and other commodities that they're producing. So all of this together is really feeding into really large increases in food prices, and I suspect we will still see further increases in food prices over the coming months. And that obviously has really damaging consequences for people who are on the lowest incomes.
And so fertilizer, you've highlighted as the specific area in food chains that we should be targeting when it comes to trying to address these issues. What can be done to alleviate the pressure that fertilizer producers and that goes into the price of fertilizer? What can actually be done?
Well, obviously, related to WTO, we need to keep sort of global trade in foods and fertilizer operating as normal, as frictionless as possible, and not see imposition of trade bans as we've already been beginning to see, for example, from India in terms of wheat and Malaysia in terms of chicken and other things. And we need to keep both food markets and fertilizer markets operating freely. But I suppose to some extent your question suggests that we need to sort of put in place market and subsidies and other measures to try and kind of return us to the status quo we were in before. And maybe that's not necessarily the right thing to do, because the food system was creating lots of negative consequences, in terms of obesity epidemic, in terms of climate change and greenhouse gases. So maybe we need to think about putting in place things to move us to a different state than we were in before, perhaps by providing bigger welfare payments to allow people to afford food that is more expensive, but we can sort of avoid the sort of more damaging consequences of what we're seeing at the moment by helping people to afford those more expensive foods rather than subsidizing food either directly or indirectly.
It's certainly an upbeat take on what the opportunity is here, and something that I know was talked about through the pandemic, that, crises like the pandemic and now like the one on the back of the war in Ukraine present an opportunity to sort of reset our systems. You mentioned India, and India has caught a lot of flack for banning the export of wheat, but India, of course, defends the decision, saying, that they need to secure food for their own population. Is that not a rational view? And how do you counter the countries that might be looking to follow India in trying to secure their own food supply and knowing that they have an obligation to their people? Sure.
Obviously, each government has an obligation to their population first and foremost, but I think it's probably self-defeating. So India is trying to control the price of wheat in this case, and food commodities more generally, by imposing those export restrictions. But all that does is fuel further the global price of commodities, of wheat, which obviously then flows back to themselves as well. So we do need to sort of have a more coordinated and less sort of cutthroat, if you want, response to these crises to avoid that kind of behaviour and sort of have an outcome that's beneficial to everybody.